Thank you, Maura. Thank you for the invitation. And indeed, where you mentioned there, our work in the 90s means that I can start by saying that this conversation and being here feels very retro to me and somewhat nostalgic, because it takes me back to those days in the 90s and early 2000s when I would spend pretty much every day of my life in the building across the road in Parliament. And indeed, yes, that the work we did as IDASA on the first code with Kader Asmal's committee that designed that code felt very important at the time. And I believe still is very important. I think it's tremendously important that representatives are bound by a code of conduct and that they have disclosure duties in relation to potential conflicts of interest. I think that remains very important work. But let me try and play the role of kind of discussant or respondent to what we've heard today, because I don't have a presentation to give. So in the interests of stimulating discussion and debate, let me offer a couple of brief thoughts. Having said that it's important, I think we have to now put that importance of these kinds of rules and institutional arrangements in a kind of wider context. And I see three elements of context. The first that has been dwelt on already, I don't need to dwell on, which is around trust. So the declining trust in representative institutions, in elected politicians, in parliaments, is a global phenomenon with obviously local repercussions. And that's a significant issue for any parliament. Secondly, the system in which the parliament sits is a hugely important contextual point. And so the Zondo Commission grappled with that, and there's been reference to that both from our first British speaker and indeed from Fazila. And Zondo, I think, conducted a very useful diagnostic analysis of Parliament's failure, and it was a significant failure. Parliament was asleep at the wheel as the executive arm of government was being captured. It allowed that thing to happen. It failed in its constitutional duty. And the reasons for that are complicated, and I don't have time to go into them, but the main point that I made in my so-called expert testimony to the Zondo Commission, commissioned as I was to give that evidence, was that part of the failure was a systems failure, because our electoral system in this country, and again, this has been referred to, unfortunately mitigates against the constitutional obligation or the constitutional authority that resides with Parliament to conduct meaningful oversight over the executive arm of government. And so it's partly a failure of, or not a failure, but necessarily, but a product of our system, our electoral system, and the fact that parties are dominant in that system. And so the seat in Parliament is not owned by the person who sits on it. It's owned by the party upon whose list that person was chosen to stand at the election time. And that's a structural flaw in our system, which weakens the individual power and authority of the member of Parliament. And where Zondo landed, and certainly this was the thrust of my submission, the system needs to find a way of insulating individual members of Parliament from the system in which they operate, and in particular, the tendency of their party bosses, as someone else put it in this discussion this morning, to dominate them and to reduce their independence and reduce and diminish their ability to exercise their constitutional duty. So we have to think of this as a system, an ecosystem, and the rules of the game, the codes of conduct, the disclosure duties are elements within that ecosystem. The third contextual point is international or global. We're sitting here as potentially momentous events unfold in Johannesburg, with the expansion of the BRICS to include 6 new members to what I suppose one might call a B11. Now, of those 11 members of BRICS, I think one would struggle to say that and even this would be a stretch, that even 3 of them are parliamentary democracies, and certainly liberal democracies. The other 8 are clearly not. Clearly not. And so South Africa, I would argue, is the most liberal democracy of the 11. Whether that's a good or bad thing, we can debate. But certainly our constitutional arrangements, our institutional arrangements, our electoral system, and the fact we're even sitting here having this conversation about Parliament today indicates that we are, in that sense, still a fundamentally liberal democracy, but with its own local characteristics. Argentina and Brazil maybe, but the other 8 not. What does that tell us about global trends? What does that tell us about the state of liberal democracy and the state of representative democracy? So that leads me then to the final point, which is all of this conversation about rules of the game, about codes of conduct, about ethics, is only really important and only really relevant if the institution over which those rules and governance systems apply are themselves powerful and relevant and important. And the trend, whether it be through trust or systems or failures that we've had in the South African Parliament for the last 15 years, or in global trends in terms of political systems and ideology, would indicate that actually, unfortunately, these institutions, for all of Anthony Smith's rhetorical defense of Parliament, would suggest that that is not the case. And so we can have a very detailed and interesting conversation about ethics and rules and codes of conduct and so on. So what? What is the right exam question to set here? And I'm not sure what the exam question of this program, of this workshop this morning is, but let me suggest that what it should be for the future, looking ahead, is firstly, does Parliament matter? Secondly, if not, why not? And thirdly, can and should we invest time and energy in making it relevant and important? Thank you.